Hello, thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. For your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is that we've decided to talk about. And I'm nervous tonight because my guest is so impressive, and I've been wanting to have him on for so long. Jeffrey C. Kinkley, Ph.D., who is from the East Coast and is here in California temporarily with his wife, who's my wife's good friend, Suze. And we're going to be talking about Jeff's adventures as a China scholar and how he got to be doing all that sort of thing through the years. He's, as you know, let me calm down some. I'm just so pleased to have you on. That's why I'm
It's
nervous.
my pleasure.
Yeah. And the first half of the show is what I call the bio segment, where I talk to you about who you are personally, only to a certain extent, not as a psychologist, of course. And then the second half of the show is we'll talk about the subject of the show, things to show your experience as a scholar of China. So how you feel right now?
Pretty good.
And I'm the nervous one. I'm fine. It's good to have you on again, of course. So let's start off with the bio stuff, okay?
Very good.
And I always have a trick question, as you know. Shall I ask it now? Or
Please do. Get it over with.
Okay. If I were to ask your best friend, who is Jeff, what would your best friend say? Jeff is what?
Pretty professorly, I suppose. With the emphasis on the professorly rather than the pretty. I'm not much of a clothes horse.
No, it's my job to be funny, not yours.
Okay. I have my nose in a book a lot of the time, or in a laptop computer.
Now, your friend is talking about you, so pretend you're your friend. Don't say I.
Okay.
Jeff is?
Jeff is a little bit of a romantic. As you probably know, as the minister who married me to my bride.
And how long ago was that?
Just 3 years ago.
3 years ago, that's right. I traveled back east to New Jersey and performed the wedding ceremony for you and your bride.
You did indeed. It was a wonderful occasion.
It was indeed, yeah. So they would say that you're a scholarly individual, and what else would they say about you, your friend?
Nothing too remarkable, I suppose. He's a little bit introverted, but as a professor, he does a lot of professional speaking, so he's calmed down a little bit. He loves wordplay, always cracking jokes and so forth.
Okay. So, and when and where were you born?
In Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, in 1948.
Illinois. And how'd you get to New Jersey?
Well, it's a long story, basically because of my employment. I now work as a history professor at St. John's University in the borough of Queens, which makes a long commute, actually, from New Jersey. But it's bearable because of the good public transportation out there. And St. John's, of course, it has been known for a long time for its basketball. It's an up-and-coming school, a Catholic university run by the Vincentian Order. And it has a strong interest in Chinese studies, and that's how I got hired there in 1979. And I've been there ever since, after having a couple years as a lecturer at Harvard, where I got my Ph.D.
79, you've been there all these years.
All those years.
And they still haven't found out about you.
I remain under the table.
So how is it now? Are you Catholic?
No. No, I'm sort of a lapsed Methodist, if you could say that. My father was a farmer, and he went to the local church, which was a Methodist church. My mother came from a long line of people. Actually, there was a fellow who published Methodist hymnals in Cincinnati called Samuel Pye. They were kind of the uppity part of the family. We heard quite a bit about them. I looked on the internet to find out what happened to the church that they founded. I think it was in Blanchester, Ohio. It's now a saloon, I'm afraid.
Is that what happened to it?
That's what happened to it.
Yeah. And your mother is still around?
Yes, she is. Going strong at the age of 94. Living by herself, although she's legally blind.
94. What was she saying knowing that you're on television here, way out here in Oregon?
I don't think anything would shock her anymore.
Brothers and sisters, do you have any of those?
Yes, I have a brother, Greg, who lives in Hawaii, and he works as a lawyer for the state of Hawaii. He's had several years in various consumer advocacy and regulatory agencies for the state of Hawaii.
I remember him. I met him at the wedding.
That's right.
Yeah.
He converted to Judaism and sang a Jewish song as part of the musical part of the ceremony.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I don't know what he was going to do, and there he is, and I'm a non-denominational or a humanist minister, and he's going to do something. I don't know what he's going to do, but then he did it, and I thought, hey, it fits fine. It was beautiful.
He has a great voice and has sung in the Honolulu Opera.
Uh-huh.
And is a cantor for his congregation.
Mm-hmm. So then, you handled that surprise question so well, I'm going to ask you another one.
Okay.
Ready? Why were you born?
Ooh.
Everyone always goes, ooh. Why were you born, Jeff?
Well, I think my bride would say I was born for that particular marriage to take place. How about that?
Okay. And is anything significant about your cultural heritage that's worth telling our viewers about?
I've always thought of myself as typically American, mixed, like you.
Mm-hmm.
Kinkley comes from the German, Kinkley.
Mm-hmm.
My father would say, it does sound a little bit crooked. Don't want people to really remember me that way, but that's a crutch you can use if you need. Mostly Scotch-Irish in blood, and there's a Swiss grandmother, or great-grandmother, a lot of different influences, mostly Midwestern farmer stock. My mother was the daughter of a steel worker in Middletown, Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Worked
for Armco Steel. Middletown was an all-American city once upon a time. The McGuire sisters, Jerry Lucas, all sorts of people came from there.
You're telling your age.
I am indeed. The McGuire sisters were before my time.
Okay.
But her father was a foreman for the steel company, so he was pretty rock-solid Republican, and therefore much of the rest of the family, I think, was much more liberal and progressive in outlook. Other than that, why did I get into Chinese studies? There is a saying that the Midwest produces lots of sinologists because they consider the area boring.
Say what you mean by sinologist again.
A China specialist.
That's what I thought, yes.
As I said of my own Champaign-Urbana, doing kind of a reverse flip on New York City, whose environs I live in now, it's a wonderful place to live, but I wouldn't want to visit there. Not that it has a high crime rate or that the locals are inhospitable or anything like that. It's just that it's totally flat. So flat that they grow corn and they send it to Iowa for the livestock to eat there. Iowa is where the livestock go. Illinois, central Illinois, it's just plain corn and soybeans.
But it's okay to visit, but you don't want to live there.
It's a great place. Lots of cultural events coming to the University of Illinois there, and good library and everything.
Mm-hmm.
At least when I was a child.
Do you claim a religious preference nowadays?
Not really. I'm sort of a generic Protestant. In ethics, you could call me strongly influenced by what I think of as Christian values. I have a kind of upbeat view of life, I think, but I don't, although, you know, as a scholar, I engage in lots of critical reflection. I wouldn't say it's necessarily spiritually oriented or even faith oriented.
Mm-hmm. A scholar. What is a scholar?
Well, one who studies,
mm-hmm.
as we say in Chinese, to study is to read books. That's the Chinese word for it.
Mm-hmm.
And in America here, of course, it's our vocation really to take nothing for granted, to be critical of everything, at least in the first instance, skeptical, and weigh opinions, conduct experiments insofar as that's possible, and just not take anything on received, as received opinion or on the grounds of faith. This isn't a point of view that's always easy in a religious institution, of course.
I would imagine, yeah, yeah. And you mentioned Harvard, and say a few more words about your formal education.
I went to the University of Chicago for my college,
Mm-hmm.
and then went to Harvard for my Ph.D. My mentor was the great Benjamin I. Schwartz, who began as a high school French teacher. Then during World War II, he was set to examining Japanese telegrams. He, being a linguistic genius, he knew a smattering of many different languages. I guess you'd call him a polyglot. He could recognize 4-character or 4-digit combinations that spelled out tank or airplane or something like that. Then he went into Chinese and Russian, some Japanese too, and he became a major interpreter of ancient Chinese thought, although part of his early claim to fame was that he was one of the first to examine the thought of Mao Zedong, the great dictator and many would say tyrant really, who founded the People's Republic of China in 1949. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out that Mao Zedong thought, as they called it in the English language Peking publications, was not just a carbon copy of Soviet Marxism-Leninism, but he had his own way of approaching projects, and you really couldn't assume that China would become a satellite of the Soviet Union. When he published these ideas in the 1950s and 60s, it was kind of a new idea.
What would China be like today without Mao Zedong?
That's a very speculative question. There are people who've written alternative histories, I suppose, about that. You know, you can, when you think of China in the late 1940s, when the Civil War was going on, there are all sorts of possible fates. It could have sunk into greater warlordism and poverty and emerged somewhat as we thought of Bangladesh in the 1980s and 90s. It might have had a happier future with the coastal cities becoming more developed, perhaps going through a series of dictatorships and semi-democracies and ending up perhaps with a society. Because of the many smart people in China, their entrepreneurial skills might have ended up more like Brazil today, as finally becoming an emerging nation.
So the Civil War in China in the 40s was between who and who?
It was between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek, yeah.
And the communists under Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Liu Shaoqi, some of his allies.
So there was a difference between the communists of Mao Zedong and Stalin's communism. Was there a difference between those two?
Yes, I think even in the 1950s. One of the things about Chinese communism in 1949 was that it was a revolution pulled off by the Chinese themselves with very little help from the Soviet Union. Unlike, say, Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Red Army simply invaded and installed its own governments.
Yes.
In some ways, China was, to that extent, compared to the communist regime of Tito in Yugoslavia. They had their own partisans. They fought their own civil war. They liberated themselves. China, of course, went to extremes of expelling what they regarded as Western imperialist influences. They surrounded some American diplomats in their consulate compounds and so forth, confiscated a lot of property. As the Korean War went on, 1950, 1953, we were actually at war with the People's Republic of China. And that, of course, greatly intensified the enmity between the United States and China. And it became dangerous even to have American friends if you were a Chinese person. So the Maoist path to socialism, some people would say it had many Stalinist aspects. Stress on heavy industry, not on consumer goods, stress on deferred gratification to build the nation of the future, a lot of utopian hopes to really remake human nature, do away with selfishness, make everybody serve the collective.
Utopian.
But on the other hand, usually using very non-utopian or dystopian ends.
Dystopian
A lot
ends.
of, sending a lot of people to labor farms, categorizing people by class background, looking for enemies of the regime in a kind of paranoid style that was typical of the Cold War days in many places. Ultimately, Mao Zedong, I think, partly due to his great failure, which was the Great Leap Forward, and was in some ways a departure from Stalinist communism because he wanted to speed up the whole socialist development and skip stages, get ahead of the Soviet Union.
Well, you're reading my mind. For the last 3 minutes, I've been thinking about how am I going to ask him about the Great Leap Forward.
Oh.
What year was that? What year is what?
1958, and it had some revivals actually in 1959, 60, so forth. Mm-hmm. It led to what the Chinese called the 3 years of bad weather and famines. Most people now think that it was due to the political system going haywire at that time. Maybe 40, 50 million people died. The causes largely being that there were such great expectations of increased crop yields that the cadres, in other words, the local leaders, Communist Party leaders at the local level, in what then were called communes, people's communes, vast areas that were integrated. Maybe you'd have only 10 to a Chinese county, that basically made people's decisions for them, even as to when and what to plant, without regard to local soil conditions and things like that. Many of these areas then had their quotas for crops. They overestimated the productivity of the fields. Then when the fields continued to produce at about the same level that they always had, they had to yield grain to the state at the levels that had been projected, not at the real levels, which might be 1/10 of what they really were, because the cadres had promised yields that were maybe 10 times higher than was humanly possible. And that led to a great famine because the state took the grain, and it took a while for reality to catch up with it. There were other problems too, like uniform policies of deep plowing that was good in some places of China, but not in others, where you might overturn stones on top of the topsoil.
So this is when you have the kind of a socialism that's dictated from the top with no consideration of what's appropriate for different areas of the country and different people.
Right. There were many members of the Communist Party who protested at their peril. They usually got locked up, criticized.
We're jumping ahead to the second half of the show. Let's continue
All right.
with the bio stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. A partner, a wife, a husband, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, do you have any of those?
Yes. My wife of 3 years, Susie.
Susie.
My childhood sweetheart.
Yeah. Can you tell her what you think of her right there in that camera?
I love you, Susie.
She's a terrific lady. Terrific
She
lady.
is, yeah.
Tell the story about how you two got together. You were sweethearts in high school or something?
What we'd call junior high school. We were
Junior
both
high.
14 years old when we were each other's first dates. I'd never dated anybody before. She was the first girl I ever asked out on a date. And she had just come back from England for 2 years while her father, a University of Illinois professor, was on sabbatical. She had an English accent, which may be one reason why I thought, oh, this is somebody I ought to get to know
English
better.
lady, what?
And this was the 1960s. We were very restrained. I don't think I ever even kissed her, but had all sorts of fantasies. We went to dances and so forth. And then she moved away to Chicago and really didn't see each other practically for 40 years in between.
How many years?
Over 40 years.
40 years?
In my little high school class of 40, I managed to get myself elected senior class president. So I used that to help fill out the guest list for the 40th class reunion. Mm-hmm. And these were the days before everybody was on Facebook, and one way or another you could find almost anybody on the internet. There were some early search sites. I used one called Zaba Search, and I managed to locate a few people of her name, including some of the correct birth date, and I called her up, invited her to the class reunion, and things went forward from that.
She was on your mind all these years.
Somewhat. I did marry in between time. Uh-huh. That marriage unfortunately came apart. Yeah, I never forgot her. And she never forgot
Isn't
me.
that amazing after all those years?
Yes.
And you are married now happily and
Very happy.
enjoying your existence.
We are.
And you're spending part of the time in New Jersey teaching at St. John's in New York and part of the time here in Oregon
That's right.
for the time.
I hope one day to become a Portlander or Beavertonian myself after I retire.
Well said. That'll be a couple of years from now, a couple, 3 years from now.
A few years from now.
And children, have any children?
I have a child from my first marriage, Matthew, who is
Delightful fella.
He's a sophomore
Yes.
at the University of Pittsburgh.
How's he doing?
Quite well. He's enjoying it, and he even found a summer job, so I patted him on the back for that.
Tell him I said hello.
I will indeed.
I think we touched on your political persuasion. You have a comment about that, or your left, right, center, or what? Where are you?
I'm left of center, I would say. Not radical. I went, my formative years actually were in the Kennedy years. I remember watching the Democratic Convention and rooting for Adlai Stevenson, believe it or not. I was a little precocious that way. I loved John F. Kennedy and his call to public service. My father was a civilian training administrator for the Air Force. And so, you know, it's incomprehensible to me, the trashing of the role of government that's sometimes going on right now.
Nowadays, yes.
But yeah, I have continued pretty much in these kind of conventional left of center politics. The Vietnam War then, of course, was a crucial thing during my college and graduate school days. And I had as one of my teachers at Chicago, Hans Morgenthau.
Morgenthau?
Yes.
Oh, he was in the Roosevelt administration, wasn't he?
That was, I think, the Secretary of the Treasury, perhaps. I don't think you go back that far.
Yeah. So how about memberships in political, social, or civic organizations? You hold memberships in anything like that that would be of interest to the viewers?
Not really. I used to donate a little bit to political campaigns, but my wife and I are of different political persuasions, so we
I was
kind of
wondering
have
if
a
I should
truce,
ask about that.
for the sake of family unity and family budget. She doesn't contribute to her causes, and I don't contribute to mine. So it's kind of a standoff.
Yeah. It's interesting because, as you know, Pat, my wife, she's not nearly as far right as I am to the left, but occasionally we get into some sort of a discussion where we need to back off and just stop.
Right.
So it's interesting when the four of us are together and see you and Susan, sometimes you get close to something like that, and I say, uh-oh. But then as the 3 years have gone by, I've noticed you're handling that better. Yeah, and your differences in political and social issues.
I think, contrary to perhaps the social psychology of many situations, having more people together is kind of a moderating influence on both of us. And,
Yes.
Yeah, we can discuss things that between the two of us might be rather difficult.
Now, are there any persons from the past or alive today that you particularly admire, look up to, that come to mind? Any names come to mind?
Oh, well, one of the ones, of course, was my mentor, Benjamin Schwartz, I mentioned. In the academic field, John K. Fairbank, who in his day was referred to as the Dean of American Sinologists, or China Scholars, was somebody who I think got me to not only take academic research seriously, but also to write in a plain style. I've never equaled him. He wrote many books for the public, including his book, The U.S. and China, which went through many editions until his death in, I believe it was 1991. He had a big influence on me. As to the kinds of public figures that I looked up to, probably the conventional political ones like John F. Kennedy, and I looked up to Lyndon Johnson for his legislative achievements, even though I fault him for, you know, the Vietnam War and so forth. The ironic thing is that Today, I would probably, wish that Richard Nixon were running against Obama. I might prefer Richard Nixon's health care program to the current Affordable Health Care Act. Actually, it is to the left, I believe, of the one that's scheduled to take place
You better
now.
apologize to Suze for that comment. Okay, what do you do for fun besides your professoring and teaching and readings and research? Anything different that you do?
Nothing particularly creative. I used to be a collector of stamps and other things, but then when I realized I could never collect them all, I kind of got depressed at the prospect. I have done a lot of bicycling, not a lot since I came out to the east, actually. It's not quite so easy, but never been particularly athletic, actually. Meeting with friends, going to movies, that sort of thing. I used to run a book club at my local library in Bernardsville, New Jersey. That was kind of fun, leading discussions.
Name 3 things that are most important to you today and to do with our political and social life in America. Prioritize what's most important today.
So, things that I think ought to happen to America?
Yes.
Well, I never would have predicted this, but I think the income disparity and disparity of power and the development of the 2 Americas has gotten to such a point that I would like to see a great homogenization of political opportunity and economic opportunity. That's something I think is necessary simply for our economic growth. I'm worried about America going down the path of other countries that have great disparities of wealth and power. I hate to put it on any particular region of the world. We often would talk about Latin America, where you have a strong moneyed elite and a church elite and so forth. But I think most Americans would not want us to go down that path. And I have worries that we are going down that path.
Yes, so do I.
Many of my other wishes, I wish we would invest more in the future, not be so narrow-minded. I wish people were, even though I myself have relatively little scientific literacy, I wish our young people were more interested in science and technology, and that we could find a way for all the peoples of the world to take delight in science and doing that. I think another thing, of course, is medical improvement, but when it comes to the medical field, I worry not so much about increasing longevity, but increasing the quality of life in the later years.
Yes. And with that, I think I'm going to get yelled at if we don't take a break here. So, Mr. Control Room and Mr. Director, can we take a break now for a few minutes? And when we come back, we'll talk more about China Scholar and what Jeffries has been about through the years as a China Scholar. Break time. Okay, we're back. Thanks for staying tuned. Now, for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people, like most of you out there, about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and whatever it is that we have decided to talk about. And the first part of the show, we talked to Jeff about who he is personally, and a little bit about China, and now let's get into a little more depth about what a China scholar is and all those kinds of things. So, why did you decide to focus on China rather than Russia, Japan, or Peru or something?
I think what attracted me to China was those funny-looking Chinese characters. They were so mysterious, so artful, so different. I started, it was almost a random choice, but I knew that China would be very important. In the 1960s, when I started, a lot of people assumed there would someday be some major conflict between the United States and China.
Mm-hmm.
I remember at the time, you really couldn't study Chinese in most high schools at that time, which is something that happens now. You could study Russian. My brother studied Russian in high school while I was studying Chinese in college, which made my civil servant father, who worked for the Air Force, observe, if this had been in the 1950s, I would have lost my security clearance. That was very Chinese, actually. What you're interested in could be an indication of your political sympathies, which we do not take for granted here in America. You can be interested in things that you do not necessarily sympathize. In those days, of course, the idea of China was completely different from what it is now, as was China itself. China in the late 60s was in the Cultural Revolution. It seemed to be developing a kind of society completely different from ours. So that was quite fascinating. And that's another reason I think that I wasn't necessarily attracted to the idea of imposing a communist solution on America. And in fact, I was kind of frightened of the idea, as many people were. But the interesting thing is that when I began studying China, it was literally academic, because I never assumed that I would ever actually be able to come to China. Maybe there's a little bit of security in being able to observe a foreign country from a distance without necessarily having to confront the reality of it. I began, for instance, in my graduate school studying a particular Chinese author, Shen Songwan, and he was one of the great authors of the 1930s and 40s. He tried to commit suicide in 1949, didn't succeed. A few of his former students tried to visit him without much success. And I went for 10 years writing this dissertation, and I thought, well,
10 years.
Probably I'll never meet the man, because this is not a place where Chinese authors who've been banned, as he was at that time, can come out and greet foreigners, and not many Americans come. It was only in 1979 that relations between the United States and China were normalized. And it was 1980 then when I was able to go to China, find out what China was really like. By that time, of course, China had completely changed. It had put itself on this path of market socialism. Socialist in some characteristics, but producing really for the capitalist world, the global capitalist world.
So what's the difference between communism and socialism? They're used interchangeably sometimes, depending on who's describing them. What went on in the Soviet Union and what went on in China. And as you said, it's been changing in China as the years have gone by. And we have a capitalism as our primary system in this country. How do these all fit together?
The system of socialism in China, communism would be the ultimate goal. Mao Zedong angered the Soviets by implying that he would get to communism from each according to his ability to each according to his needs much faster. But his was much more of a grassroots, lift yourself up by your bootstraps system. The kind of comparison between the two systems, one of the classic examples was the kind of tractor farms. Under the Soviet system, allegedly, which Mao Zedong's alleged enemies, like the President Liu Shaoqi had. The idea was you'd have all these self-sufficient communes, and then you'd have the state import tractors from Czechoslovakia or the Soviet Union, set up a tractor farm, and whenever harvest came, the different communes could go contract out the tractors and harvest their crops. All under state planning. You'd hire lots of people who were good mechanics with tractors, good statisticians, people who could figure out exactly what time each commune would have its harvest and rationally lay out things. This would, of course, anger a lot of people at the local level because they wanted their tractors right now. The Maoist strategy was to have each commune have its own tractor if and when it could afford it. Don't rely on central bureaucracy. Fire all those statisticians, all those people who want to spend our foreign exchange on importing tractors. Let's make our own tractors while we're at it, and maybe we can come up with a cheaper kind of tractor of our own invention. But let's let each of the communes decide itself. Will we spend our money on a new assembly hall so we can have many more meetings and praise Chairman Mao? Will we build a match factory or a soap factory? Or will we buy some tractors to increase our output of rice?
Are the Chinese people nowadays more satisfied with their existence than they were, say, before Mao came along?
Well, expectations is always a difficult thing to measure because expectations keep going up. I think it's undoubtedly true that the average standard of living in China is much higher, and certainly people in the cities, even with their amnesia about what the Mao Zedong era was like, are much more satisfied. They're much prouder of China in a way, I think, because of its economic triumphs. There are a lot of suffering people. A lot of peasants now become migrant laborers that work in the cities. And some of them are pretty miserable. They work for Foxconn and these, factories that make Apple iPads and things and
for
commit
American
suicide.
Consumers, yeah.
Right, world consumers. And so there's a lot of misery. I think the main thing that China has to worry about now is that expectations have been raised so high. They have mass media now that not only on television but on the internet that create expectations of a upper middle class lifestyle that if China cannot continue with its 10% annual growth,
right,
then people will get very upset, and reality will again begin to close in on people's expectations, and the political system people will think cannot deliver, and it could be rather unsettling for China.
So the economic system now in China today, I understand that they have things that look like capitalist incentives and those kinds of things. So is China moving more toward a capitalist system than a communist system?
It has to play by the rules of the global market economy. In some ways, American, or are they really American or not? Multinational corporations
Well said.
and the Communist Party in China are a match made in heaven because you can set up a factory in China and you don't ever have to worry about strikes. You can set the Walmart price, the China price, and people will have to take it. One of the interesting things about Walmart, as probably most of your viewers know, Walmarts don't allow unionization.
Right.
Except in China.
In China they do.
In China they have to have unions. The unions are controlled by the Communist Party. They are not in the business of raising workers' wages or helping them foment strikes. They want workers not to get ill and not to skip work and to increase productivity and glorify China. They will get involved if, for instance, a foreign supervisor insults a Chinese worker. That becomes a national pride matter, and they will get involved in that.
What's going on between Taiwan and China, the People's Republic of China. Those are two separate nations on the world scene. What's going on there?
Well, my field is Chinese literature, so I can't really claim to have the latest word there. It is, of course, a very difficult situation. Taiwan has evolved as a separate society for all these years since 1949, a very proud, very prosperous society that in the early years of the relaxations from Mao Zedong's stern communism outpaced China in growth. In recent years, the Taiwanese economy has slowed down even faster than the Chinese economy, which is slowing down now. And the two economies are mutually interdependent. But of course, China is the big brother and Taiwan is the little brother. It's when China sneezes, Taiwan does catch a cold. Taiwan really developed a democratic society with mass protests and citizen involvement. It elected the opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party, had a president in 2000 who unfortunately was later accused of being corrupt. But this was the acid test of a democracy. If the ruling party loses an election, is it willing to cede power?
Yes.
And it did cede power. And the old Kuomintang, the old Nationalist Party, which originally ruled the China mainland back in the 30s and 40s,
Chiang Kai-shek,
is now in power. They have tamped down some of the tensions between mainland China and Taiwan. So, as before, people live under the fiction that probably someday the mainland of China and Taiwan will get together. Nobody is saying exactly when. Previously, under Jiang Zemin, there may have been kind of a timetable. The Chinese on the mainland were getting rather desperate and thinking, we better see concrete progress. Under the current leadership, I think they're willing to let things slide for the time being, as long as Taiwan is not too provocative.
You keep reading my mind. The next question I'm going to ask you, you answer it before I ask it. Please go on.
Well, I was going to say one more thing. My friends from China can never understand why Taiwan doesn't want to unite with China. Sort of in the same way that Americans probably have a hard time wondering, why don't the Canadians want to join the United States? That's something that's existed in many eras of American history.
But the East and West Germans got together to now there's one Germany.
But in the Canadian case, it is precisely because there is this big bully, the United States to the south, that Canadians don't want to join and be swallowed up by it.
Suze is going to get you when you get home tonight, that big bully of the United States. I'm protecting you, Suze.
Well, this is part of the psychology of a great nation. People want to belong to a big nation with big armed forces that can bully other people. They don't want to belong to a small nation that is always bullied by others. At least that's the psychology of the big bully nation.
Okay, all right. I got a question here. Will you share with us some of your more salient learnings or experiences in your chosen pursuit or professorship? That's pretty broad in general.
Oh.
Any thoughts come to mind that?
Well, I can tell you of some of my interesting experiences in China when I went in 1980. This was just a few years after the death of Mao in 1976. We usually say that it was 1978 that Deng Xiaoping consolidated his power and began to move China toward market socialism and stopped some of the surveillance of Chinese people. They stopped all wearing blue tunics and trousers, men and women alike. Little stands, restaurants, ultimately private factories began to grow in China as years. But in 1980, China was just barely recovering from Maoism, and in fact, one of the places I visited was Chairman Mao's old province of Hunan, which was evolving away from the old Mao-style socialism rather slowly. And I had some interesting experiences there. In those days, a foreigner could not travel freely in China. There were some cities as well as areas in the countryside that simply were forbidden to foreigners, and China itself was just beginning to come out of its system where to buy certain things like food and cotton for cloth, they didn't have that many ready-made clothing stores. Most people made their clothes at home. If you wanted these things, you needed not only cash, but you needed ration tickets. China was just beginning to change from that. A foreigner, if he wanted to do research in China, had to belong to a particular unit, an organization, a bureaucratic organization. A scholar would belong to a research academy or a university or something like that. You couldn't just go out and interview people on your own or do field research. So when I went to China, I went out to various provinces, I was accompanied by 3 different people. We sometimes used to call these people, rather unceremoniously, handlers. The Chinese had a kind of unceremonious term too, peitung, the person who went along with you. So I had one from my own unit, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. And then when I went into the province of Hunan, which was still leftist, as they put it, relatively pro-Mao. They wished that Deng Xiaoping hadn't come to power. I picked up a man from the provincial government who was in charge of handling foreigners. And then when I got to a county, which was the birthplace of the author I was studying, Shen Congwen, I picked up a third. It was the head of the Revolutionary Committee. And so every time I stepped out of the hostel where I was put up to stay, I was accompanied by these 3 gentlemen. They were all suspiciously looking at each other. The man from Beijing wanted me to have a successful trip to improve Sino-American relations. That was really the only thing he cared about. The local fellow, the head of the county, wanted to glorify the native son that I was going to write a book about. The man from Changsha, the capital of Hunan, was suspicious of the man from Beijing as, you know, like a bureaucrat from on top. What's he doing? And he didn't really trust the yokels at the local level either. They were partly of an ethnic minority. So it was kind of interesting. The most interesting thing was when I went on a jeep trip. The locals insisted that I visit a new reservoir. Now, being in China studies, I didn't really care to see this reservoir. One reservoir is we have them in central Illinois. Yeah. But I knew that it was pointless for me to object. They were proud of it, and maybe they could get a newspaper article out of this. So we took a jeep trip. And this jeep trip went from the county seat to the reservoir, but it had to pass through another province. And there I got a little sense of Chinese localism. Even though I was accompanied by a man from Beijing, a man from the provincial capital of Hunan, and a man from the local county which bordered on the reservoir, which was at the border between 2 provinces, we went into another province. And I wanted to get out of the jeep and take a look at some of the wonderful scenery there. And they said, all right, but please be quick. We don't have authorization to pass through this province. These 3 proud bureaucrats. Thinking back on it now, probably what they meant was, we don't have authorization to take a foreigner into another province before passing back into our own.
Why were they so careful?
Well, because as in any bureaucratic system, if you make a mistake, you have to answer for it.
Wasn't there a history of China being abused and used by Europeans for many, many years?
Oh, yes. Imperialism, we call it.
Oh, okay.
China never was actually colonized like India.
Yeah.
But it signed a lot of treaties, which the Chinese call the unequal treaties. And this still is the basis of what's taught about 19th century China. It's kind of interesting. You know, Chinese history textbooks have been the basis of diplomatic protests, the same as Japanese, but diplomatic protests by the United States, the same as Japanese textbooks that cover up Japanese misdeeds during World War II are the subject of diplomatic protests by China and South Korea and sometimes the United States, I think.
We need another 2 hours.
We do.
Time is winding down, but I want to be sure we get some comment from you about these 2 books you bought. So, what are you going to say about that?
Well, I have written a few books, and I'm also a translator. HarperCollins has put out a book by this author, Shen Congwen, S-H-E-N-C-O-N-G-W-E-N, called The Border Town, which is probably more accessible to most people than my scholarly books. But I did do a book called Chinese Justice, the Fiction, which is about Chinese detective stories and how in the post-Mao period, Chinese legal scholars and lawyers and actually policemen wrote detective stories, sometimes for the progressive cause of reforming and liberalizing the Chinese legal system. At about the time of the Great Leap Forward, one of the things that happened, they abolished the Ministry of Justice, they abolished the profession of lawyering, which some people may think is good, but anything can be taken to an extreme. I believe there were 4 recognized lawyers in China in the late 50s and 60s. So people wrote detective stories to entertain the public and also promote a new idea of rule of law.
And a new idea of rule of law. What is that about?
Well, the idea that party bureaucrats should not decide who goes to jail and who doesn't.
Sure.
And you should at least put people through a legal system. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to have an independent judiciary that's not under the sway of the Communist Party. They're very far from that, unfortunately. But it still is an ideal that some people have. The next book, Corruption and Realism, this is in a way a follow-on. There was a brief period in the late 1990s, up to about 2002, when the government cracked down on them, when Chinese authors began to write very political novels, discussing problems largely of corruption. In those days, the major form of corruption had to do with the reform of the big state factories. It's not really true to say, I think, that factories have all been privatized in China. In many ways, China in the 1990s consolidated, fired a lot of people, confiscated a lot of pension funds. When the funds went into the pockets of private party cadres that went into millionaires' homes in Princeton, New Jersey, or West Windsor, that was corruption. When the profits were used to consolidate factories in strategic industries, that was all right. And much of the economic miracle, I think, according to a book by James McGregor, The Party, has been these state-owned enterprises. Not the capitalist ones owned by private, but they are run as if they were run by savvy private entrepreneurs. Anyway, for the bad cases, the cases that misfired, a lot of Chinese authors wrote novels to basically, we would call them romans à clef, novels that tell about real situations but change the names. And, you know, graft, corruption, bribery, privatization of public assets, as happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. These were the kind of things that set people on fire. Suicides of major party cadres and so forth. They became a source of intense interest to the Chinese people. Journalism was severely limited, but you could write novels about these things and disguise the truth and sometimes even come up with your own theories as to who was at the root of the problem.
What's going to happen to China in the next 5 or 10 years? Any speculation? I know that's really stretching it.
I have no idea. There are 2 schools of thought, at least. One is that because of the great level of social protest, in the 90s and the last few years, it's often been at the local level where factories move in, they pollute the environment, local people have no recourse. Or in the cities where the government requisitions. You have eminent domain gone wild. City governments confiscate vast housing developments, level them, build new luxury condos, some of which remain almost a ghost town for a time. This has led to a lot of social dissatisfaction and maybe tens of thousands of what the Chinese consider to be riots. Now, if, as during the last year, China's 10% annual economic growth goes down, then people may be asking serious questions about whether the Chinese Communist Party really can continue. The other, but I think, you know, the Chinese are fairly resilient and they put up with a lot of unfavorable situations. I would use a more colloquial term, but it might not even be appropriate for cable.
No. What would you say to the viewers now about your chosen profession and what they should do with their studies and their careers?
Well, first of all, Chinese culture and Chinese language are a delight for anyone. And regardless of what happens politically, although I wish the best of the Chinese people, it's a great culture with a great tradition. Certainly, people should study it as much as they can, and it will be very enlightening. Chinese poetry alone will reward your efforts.
We got to have you back again. So before we say goodnight, I want to thank my wonderful crew in the control room, and thank you for coming on. It's been delightful.
Thank you,
and
Dr.
we can
Don.
spend another hour easily. So I want to thank viewers in other parts of the country for watching the show. And I got to tell you about a few public service announcements to get my show local broadcast in other communities around the country. Go to www.donbaham.com and click on present day activities. To watch my shows on the web, go to my website again and click on favorite links. There's a whole bunch of shows on there that you can see that I've done through the years. And we're going to tell you about the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, because without the ACLU, our civil liberties in this country would be down the tubes totally, instead of partially now. And I want to tell you about to have other shows broadcast, my shows broadcast by other stations. Ask your local public access station to go to www.pegmedia.org. And I think we have one more to learn how to end corporate personhood. We've got to do that. Go to www.movetoamend.org. We've got to take our country back and take it out of the clutches of the corporations and have our voices heard. So thanks for watching. And remember, KFC, not that KFC, Dr. Don's KFC, kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable to you too. And you too. You too. Thanks again for watching.